Hello everyone. This is not going to be quick. It's not a question, and it's not just for Jehovah's Witnesses. As you can tell, this video is already a little bit different. I got my bifocals on. And that's because I'm going to read a book which has some very, very small print, so I'm going to need these things to be able to see those words. I'd like to start this video off with a statement. That statement being, if the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society is not a false prophet, then Jehovah's Witnesses owe Harold Camping an apology. Who's Harold Camping, and why would they owe him an apology? Harold Camping is the radio preacher who prophesied that the end of the world was going to happen on May 21st, 2011. Obviously, that didn't happen. And why do the Jehovah's Witnesses owe him an apology? Well, because they're calling him a false prophet. My wife has actually met with a couple of Jehovah's Witnesses recently, right after that weekend, and they've certainly referred to him as a false prophet, as well they should. But what we're going to do here in this video is we're going to compare Harold Camping and his false prophecy to the Watchtower and the prophecies that they have made in the past. On his May 23rd radio broadcast, the Monday after that fateful weekend, Harold Camping explains why his interpretation was wrong and what happened. The first 35 minutes of that interview is that explanation, and then the rest of the interview is him answering questions from various reporters. So, as I was listening to this broadcast, I could not help but see tremendous similarities between Harold Camping's excuses and the excuses that the Watchtower has used regarding their false prophecies too. In fact, if you're a Jehovah's Witness and you're listening to this, I would like you to go and listen to Harold Camping's radio interview. I'll have a link to that here in this video so that you can listen to it. It's more than an hour long, but seriously, listen to it. And I want you to imagine that he is a member of the governing body. He's 89 years old. Okay, so he could be. I mean, if he was a Jehovah's Witness, he could be a member of the governing body. And then ask yourself, why is it that the things that he's saying is wrong? But if he was a Jehovah's Witness, he could be using the same explanations and it would be okay. It'd be printed in the next edition of the Watchtower and everything would be fine. I invite you to do that. So what we're going to be doing here is I'm going to be going back and forth between things that Harold Camping said and then quotes from the Watchtower. I've got a bunch of quotes here. I'm not going to read all of them, but I do have them listed in the show more link there under the bottom of the video here. So please check them out for yourself and check the context. First thing I want to mention is that one of the reporters asked Harold Camping a question if he thinks that he's made a mockery of religion because obviously things didn't happen the way that he thought they were supposed to happen. Well, now, interestingly enough, the Watchtower agrees with that line of question, as do I, and as should you. The Watchtower, 10/15/1958, page 613 says, sometime between April 15 and 23, 1957, Armageddon will sweep the world. Millions of persons will perish in its flames, and the land will be scorched. So prophesied a certain California pastor in January of 1957. Here's their commentary on that. Such false prophets tend to put the subject of Armageddon in disrepute. I agree with that. The Watchtower agrees with that. The Watchtower is pointing to people like Harold Camping and saying that you are bringing disrepute on the subject of Armageddon, the end of the world, end time theology, any of that. So by coming up with dates that don't produce any kind of real fruit, you are showing yourself as a false prophet. Well, the Watchtower also fits into that category, as we will see. So next thing I wanted to mention is that Harold Camping made an interesting claim. He said that God arranged the campaign. All of the tracts that they passed out, all of the billboards that they used, all of the traveling that they did in the different vehicles with all the placards and stuff that were all over the vehicles, God arranged all those details and it fit perfectly. I couldn't help but ask myself the question, why would God arrange the campaign for false prophecy? I don't understand that. And as a Jehovah's Witness, if you're listening to that, that probably makes sense to you. that question, why would God arrange the campaign for false prophecy? It doesn't make sense. However, the Watchtower has stated something very similar. Watchtower 515, 1955, page 316. By means of this singular channel of reliable spiritual guidance, all sincere, honest persons who love righteousness are being directed toward the perfect day in the post-Armageddon new world. You are invited to advance along with the anointed remnant from one God-directed progressive spiritual position to another. God-directed spiritual position. Why would God direct you to a spiritual position which only needs to be changed? That doesn't make sense to me. Anyway, the rest of the quote says, the path of the righteous is as the dawning light that shineth more and more unto the perfect day. Obviously, that's an allusion to the doctrine of new light, which Jehovah's Witnesses use as an excuse to cover up their different false prophecies and doctrinal changes. Now, what's interesting is that right about the 4:05 mark of Harold Camping's interview, he says something very similar. He says he was thinking and praying and doing study and reading all different kinds of articles and watching different news agencies about his false prophecy, and then suddenly he felt better. The light dawned. He now understood why his prophecy was false. And what he stated was that we need to look at things spiritually. The Bible is a spiritual book, and we need to interpret it spiritually. So he's saying that even though we didn't see anything happen, the Lord did return on May 21st, 2011. He just returned spiritually. He's now pointing to October 21st, 2011 as the final date, yet claims that there is no change in the program. What he's saying is that May 21st was a spiritual application, and October 21st is going to be the literal physical fulfillment. So he still had those dates. He just didn't emphasize it. He was emphasizing the one because he expected to be raptured, and there was supposed to be a great big earthquake and all kinds of catastrophes on May 21st. Obviously, none of that happened. But now all of that is supposed to happen on October 21st. Probably do another video on October 22nd. So anyway, before I move on, I want to explain exactly how similar Harold Camping's view is to the Watchtower's previous view. Prior to 1876, Charles Taze Russell believed that the Lord was going to return physically and agreed with the interpretation of a number of Second Adventists who thought that Jesus was going to return in 1874. Obviously, when that didn't happen, people wanted to understand why. And Russell was a reader of a Second Adventist magazine called the Herald of the Morning, where someone who another reader had written in and said, hey, I noticed something about Matthew 24. We should not translate Matthew 24:27 as coming, but it should be rendered as presence, like the emphatic diglot explains. And that was the clue. That was a clue that let them all in on, oh, well, this wasn't supposed to be a physical return. This was supposed to be spiritual. So another Adventist preacher, actually an author, his name was Nelson Barber, he started to proclaim that Christ did return in 1874. He just came invisibly. He came spiritually. And Charles Russell actually paid this guy's expenses to come visit him in Philadelphia and explain to him. In fact, I'll read this part of the quote. It says, I paid Mr. Barber's expenses to come see me at Philadelphia to show me fully and scripturally, if he could, that the prophecies indicated 1874 as the date at which the Lord's presence in the harvest began. He came, and the evidence satisfied me. That's on page 54 of the Finished Mystery, volume 7 of the Studies in the Scriptures. In fact, I've got that book right here. I just chose to read it out of the Word document there. Don't worry, I'll have all these quotes underneath the Show More section so that you can read them for yourself. So that's the basic bottom line here. You've got Camping saying that, well, May 21st is a spiritual application and October 21st is the real deal. Russell did the same thing. Russell points back to 1874 and says, well, Jesus came back spiritually in 1874, and now let's point to a new date, 1914. October of 1914. So Russell starts printing this magazine in 1879, which is the original Watchtower, which was called at the time Zion's Watchtower and Herald of Christ's Presence, because he believed that Christ was already present. And now they're pointing to 1914. It says, finally that day arrived, October 1st, 1914. The Gentile times ended, but the anticipated heavenly glorification of the church did not come about. So he was expecting to be raptured on that day. That didn't happen. Well, the Watchtower still hung on to the 1874 date, until 1943, when the Watchtower presented a book, The Truth Shall Make You Free. And then that changed Christ's presence from 1874 to what Jehovah's Witnesses believe today, to 1914. Now I give you all that history just to show you that camping is doing nothing more than taking a page out of the Watchtower's playbook. They take the original date, they spiritualize it, they now emphasize a second date. It's the same thing that camping did. He takes the original date, spiritualize it, now he's going to focus on the next date. I'm wondering if he's going to do the same thing that Russell did regarding 1914. Actually, not Russell, but the Watchtower did later on in 1914, and says, hey, now that's supposed to be the spiritual interpretation. So who knows? Maybe we've got that video to do next. Next part that I wanted to read here is about the 31-minute mark of Camping's video. He says, all of our dates and proofs are correct. God had not yet opened our eyes that May 21 was a spiritual coming, as we thought it was a physical coming. He has come in a sense that he has come in the world, or that he has the world in judgment. So he's changing his interpretation of what it means to come. So Watchtower does the same thing. Watchtower 3104, page 16. Jesus said to come in different instances. He does not need to move physically in order to come. Rather, he comes in the sense of returning his attention to mankind or to his followers, often for judgment. Thus, in 1914, he came to begin his presence as enthroned king. In 1918, he came as a messenger of the covenant and began judging those claiming to serve Jehovah. At Armageddon, he will come to execute judgment on Jehovah's enemies. So you've got the same thing happening here. They're just redefining terms about Jesus coming. About the 36-minute mark of the video, Camping's interview, a reporter points out that many people sold their properties for the May 21st date, and that now they're flat broke. And this person asks the question, will you take responsibility for that? And he says, well, we didn't tell them to do anything with their possessions. Well, let me read something to you here. This is out of a Kingdom Ministry 574, pages 3 and 4. It says, reports are heard of brothers selling their homes and property and planning to finish out the rest of the days in this old system in the pioneer service. Certainly, this is a fine way to spend the short time remaining before the wicked world's end. Now, there's the rest of the section there. It's too lengthy to read, but I'm going to have that posted in the Show More section. It's just a big, heavy guilt trip on Jehovah's Witnesses and proving to them that regardless of their means or their time constraints, they are able to go out and pioneer and put in all the hours that they need to do to predict the 1975 date, which, again, was a failure. So, same thing. You got people selling their earthly goods because they're expecting to not need them because the end of the world's going to come. At the 39-minute mark of the interview, it says, someone says, is it fair for people who committed to him to live their lives in this way, not having any kinds of means to provide for themselves, and asks, do you feel any personal responsibility to all these people who are putting their hopes and their trust in you? Here's what he says. Listen to this. He says, I'm not the authority. The Bible is the authority. I will show you where to look in the Bible, but all I am is a humble teacher. The structure of God's timeline has not changed at all. So God's timeline hasn't changed, and he's not the authority. He's just the guy pointing out where to look in the Bible. But God's dates haven't changed. This is a very, very old book. This is, I'm going to read out of the July 15th, 1894 Watchtower. And someone writes into the Watchtower, and again, now they're pointing to 1914. They're saying 1914 is going to be the end of the world. But people want to know if the world can really last that long, because things are looking really bad, terrible. So can the world last that long? And Russell writes here, we see no reason for changing the figures, nor could we change them if we would. They are, we believe, God's dates, not ours. But bear in mind that the end of 1914 is not the date for the beginning, but for the end of the time of trouble. We see no reason for changing from our opinion expressed in the view presented in the Watchtower, January 15th, 1892. We advise that it be read again. So prior to 1914, they didn't see 1914 as a spiritual event. They saw it as a literal, physical Armageddon end of the world. God's date. What does Camping say? I'm not the authority. This is God's timeline. I'm just reading it out of the Bible. Well, if you're going to tell me that it's God's timeline, then I get the impression that you're telling me that that's inspired. So if you're telling me that this is God's date, same thing. We've got to be saying that that is inspired. It's God's date after all. So actually, someone asked a question. I had heard about this. This one lady had tried to kill herself and her two daughters, a camping follower, after everything did not happen on May 21st. And this person asks the question, do you take any responsibility for that? Again, same kind of answer. I don't have any responsibility. I'm only teaching the Bible. I'm not teaching that I'm the authority, only this is what the Bible says. At the 55-minute mark, I have never told anybody that I'm infallible. Not at all. But God's proofs are infallible because they come right out of the Bible. You see what he's doing? I'm not infallible. The Bible is infallible. But I'm telling you what the Bible means. That's called circular reasoning. If you are going to say that you are telling people what the Bible means and that it's God's interpretation or God's date or God's whatever you want to call it, God's timeline, it has to be by very definition inspired. This is what the Watchtower says, 7179, page 5. Of course, even though this magazine has published such enlightening material, we do not claim to be infallible. It is to Jehovah God that we look gratefully for spiritual direction. Well, how do they look to Jehovah God for spiritual direction? The 10/891 Awake magazine on page 13 answers that question. Thus, we are enlightened by God's answers to present-day problems. Those answers come to us through the channel of the faithful and discreet anointed slave class, which uses the Watchtower Society as its publishing agency. Starting to see that circle again. 9/15/10/2010, Watchtower, page 16. The governing body publishes spiritually encouraging literature in many languages. Thus, this spiritual food is based on God's word. Thus, what is taught is not from men, but from Jehovah. They're doing the same thing that Camping did. I'm not the authority. The Bible is the authority. I'm telling you what the Bible means. The Watchtower says, we're not infallible. We're not the authority. We're just telling you what the Bible means. This is God's date. This is God's interpretation. Again, if it's God's, then it's got to be inspired. Someone asks the question at the 49-minute mark of the video, are you saying that mere humans cannot understand the Bible? He states, you are correct. Then he goes on to about how we have to study and pray. This is the Watchtower 12/181, page 27. Jehovah God has also provided his visible organization, his faithful and discreet slave, made up of spirit-anointed ones to help Christians in all nations to understand and apply properly the Bible in their lives. Unless we are in touch with this channel of communication that God is using, here's the key part, we will not progress along the road to life no matter how much Bible reading we do. So, we need the Watchtower. That's what the Watchtower is saying. I can't understand the Bible on my own. I need the Watchtower to interpret it for me. What is Camping saying? Mere humans cannot understand the Bible. You've got to have somebody explain it to you. Camping, Watchtower, same thing. The last thing that I want to talk about it's a very, very interesting argument that both Camping and the Watchtower uses. Uh, Camping, when a reporter talks to him about all the problems and the false prophecy, he humbly accepts that and says that other pastors, when they make mistakes, they don't admit it. So he's such a nice guy because he's admitting that his expectation was failed, but he won't call it a false prophecy. Again, at the 55-minute mark, he says, we all make mistakes. At the 1:19 mark, 1 hour and 19-minute mark of this video, it's the long video, he says again that most pastors, they never admit the mistake because they want to preserve their own credibility. And he says that he's going to go to the Bible and he's going to admit his mistake. And that doesn't hurt his credibility in the Bible at all. It just shows that we're perfect. God needs to keep opening our eyes. And God resists the proud but gives grace to the humble. And then he says this quote here. It's a wonderful way to live when we walk humbly before God, because you're never trying to show how smart you are or how wise you are. You are simply giving all the credit to God, and that's where it should go. Why should God get the credit for your false prophecy, Mr. Camping? I don't get that. But I've had many Jehovah's Witnesses use the same kind of argumentation for me. Hey, we're wrong. Okay, but at least we're admitting that we're wrong, and that proves that we're right because we're admitting that we're wrong. Does that make any sense? 10/15, 1954 Watchtower on page 639. It says, in fact, this ability to discard the erroneous as the light increases marks the difference between Jehovah's true worshipers and the false religions of Christendom. When it can be clearly shown from the Bible that an idea once held does not have sufficient scriptural support and that a different viewpoint has the weight of the Bible testimony behind it, then the new viewpoint is adopted and the former understanding is set aside. So again, they're praising themselves for getting it wrong, but admitting that they got it wrong. And somehow that's supposed to comfort us in knowing that they're really God's organization because they're admitting that they're wrong. You're not addressing the issue. The issue is, why was it wrong? If it's God's date, if it's God's interpretation, if it's God's timeline, then you are saying, again, this is God's viewpoint. You are taking his name. You are proclaiming things in his name and saying, this is what God says, when it does nothing more than point out that really this is just your interpretation. So again, I'd like to end the video with the statement, if the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society is not a false prophet, then Jehovah's Witnesses owe Harold Camping an apology.